Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Alyssa Fader. I am the training director here at Emily's List. It's great to see you all. This is my first time wearing these very large headphones with all of you, so I would appreciate any feedback that you have. And I'm really excited for today's webinar, What Office Should I Run For? So to get us started, I want to tell you all a little bit about Emily's List. For those of you who have not joined our webinars before, we are the largest resource for women in politics. We work with women like you to make sure that women are represented at all levels of government, from the highest offices in the land to state and local office to school boards and municipalities. So we're really excited to have you all today for today's webinar. I want to go through our agenda super quickly. First, we're going to do some welcome and housekeeping announcements, which is what we're doing right now. We're going to then talk about finding your why, finding the right race, understanding your community, and questions and answers. And very excitingly, sporadically throughout this entire webinar, we're going to have some very special guests. So you're going to hear from Emily's List women who have run for office, how they decided what office they should run for, and any advice that they have as you're making your decisions. As you can see also, there's a Q&A section here. We have some folks coming in from our state and local campaigns team to answer some of your questions. So you could put questions in the chat box as we go through, and also we'll have an allotted time for Q&A at the end. So if you've got burning questions, put them in, write them down. We want to get to them. So that said, I'm so excited to introduce our first special guest today, Athena Hollins. Athena Hollins was born in rural Hawaii. Her mother was a social worker and her father was a veteran and small business owner. Together, they instilled in her the value of working hard and helping those in need. She attended Reed College, where she started her activism through her work with the Queer Alliance, Amnesty International, and the Feminist Student Union. She would later attend University of St. Thomas for law school, and while attending, she would further develop her student organizing work by participating in the Black Law Students Association, the LGBTQ+ Student Association, and the Lawyers Council on Social Justice. Once Athena passed the bar, she worked in family law and later found herself in a community relations position where she managed community grants and diversity and inclusion efforts, among many other things. It was also during this time that Athena had her first child. And because she wanted to make her neighborhood a great place for her daughter, Athena joined the Payne-Fallon Community Council. She ran for the Minnesota House of Representatives in 2020, and she won. She represents District 66B in the Minnesota House of Representatives, which includes portions of St. Paul, and I am extremely excited to have Athena on as our first speaker today. So I'm going to go disappear for a bit and have Athena give you all of her sage wisdom.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Emily's.
Unmute yourself, I think.
Am I
Classic
unmuted now?
Quarantine sentences. Oh no, I still can't hear you.
You can't hear me?
No, we can hear you.
Okay, everyone else can hear you, so it must be on my end. Sorry about that. Carry on. Sorry, everybody. Thank you.
No problem. Well, I just wanted to thank Emily's List for having me here. It's so surreal to be speaking to you all as opposed to sitting in the audience listening, which is what I did a lot in 2019 and 2020. But I am really delighted to be here and to be sharing with you some of my experience and some of the reasons why I decided to run where and when I did. So I'll rewind a little bit. So not talking about the House race, but going to district council, which is a weird entity. I think the city of St. Paul might be the only city in the United States or one of two cities in the United States that has district councils. And what they are they're nonprofit entities that advise city council and do community outreach on behalf of city council, of the St. Paul City Council, to find out what issues are top of mind for the different community members and different neighborhoods or districts. And so they're sort of quasi-governmental. We interact with government agencies, but not necessarily making decisions that have to be followed, or rules or policy that has to be followed. And so I really, I started there because I love my neighborhood, I love my neighbors, and I love the community in which it is. And I'll be honest, I did wait a couple of years after my first child was born to jump into that because I knew it would be a time commitment and it would be something that I wanted to give my whole self to as much as possible and do a really good job at. And so I when I joined that, those were sort of the thoughts that were going through my head. Um, and I was in the district council and I served as an at large executive committee member as well as vice chair and then chair. And I just resigned as chair um, because of the possible conflict of interest now that I'm a state legislator. Um, so when I ran for Minnesota State House, there were a couple of things that were top of mind for me, having had that experience with the district council. And so really the top things I was looking at was balance. So balancing my career and my family and campaigning. And then what issues were important to me. And then what strengths did I have? And so those are the three things that I really want to talk to you all about. Um, the first one's really practical, right? Like balancing your career and your family is so important. And if you're anything like me, a good portion, a good part of why you're doing it is probably because of people that you love who live in your state or your city or your community. And I count that all of that as family. I, in particular, had to think about the fact that I had, my daughter who is 7 years old now, my son who is just 2 years old, and when I started running for office for the House seat, he was not even a year old yet. And so that was really tricky. Like that was, I'm not gonna lie, it was really hard to balance that and to ask my partner to do a lot of the work when it came to taking care of the children. And so I think that's something that we absolutely have to think about when we're running for office, but it's not insurmountable. I have told people, and this is probably TMI, but I was breastfeeding throughout, almost my entire campaign, right? So you could hear me like making campaign phone calls and like have the breast pump in the background, like making noise, because that was just the reality that I had to live. And if people asked me about it, I was really honest and forthright about with them about it because that's my lived reality. And a lot of people had respect for that. They understood that I was trying to balance those things and but still contribute to my community. The second reason, and the thing that I think you have to consider when you're running, is identifying your issues. And I think it's most important to look at your issue first because that really guides where you want to go. So my particular issue, I was and am very concerned and passionate about climate change and climate justice. And what I saw was a lack of climate champions at the state level, particularly from my city. So we're in St. Paul, right? There's St. Paul and Minneapolis. Minneapolis has some amazing climate champions, but St. Paul did not. And that's unfortunate because living in a major metropolitan area is the place where we can be champions for these sorts of things because we have the flexibility and political support to really back some progressive issues. And so that was my thought process in going for a state level as opposed to a city level where we do have a lot of great work going on, or a county level where there are also passionate people. What I identified was an issue, which was climate change, and where I thought it was lacking. And where I thought it was lacking was at the state. And the final thing is playing to your strengths. I personally, um, I consider myself a people person. I'm pretty outgoing. And I think that that makes a huge difference in how you campaign and um, what particular branch of government you want to be pursuing. If you like working with people, then you should be in a place like the legislature where that is a requirement, right? Like collaborating is part of what you have to do. And so that was really my impetus for saying this is something that I want to do with the legislature, with working as a team as opposed to a single entity all by myself. That being said, I've met people who are tremendous, they're introverted statistics nerds, and they also work out well at the legislature because as a part of every team, we need all sorts of different people to be representing different areas. And so um, I think that when we play to our strengths, we're able to um, be the very best elected official that we possibly can be. And I personally think that you shouldn't shy away from those strengths. You should just lean right into them and say, this is who I am, and this is how I'm going to do things. And I think people like and respect you for that. So, but I think it's an important consideration when we're looking at what what position you should run for. So I'll leave it at that. It was kind of rambling, and I apologize, but hopefully it's helpful as you decide on your political career going forward. The last thing I'll leave you with is there, I think there is this perception, especially among women, of this idea of like the Mr. Smith goes to Washington and the things you have to do to be a good politician. And it's just totally unfounded and untrue. There is, making grandstanding speeches and, getting applause and things like that. That's fine. And that works for some folks, but that's also very ineffective for some people. So, whatever direction you want to go, I say make a plan and go with it. And definitely don't underestimate your ability to be effective in whatever area you pursue. Thank you.
Thank you. Not rambling at all. So helpful. I learned so much, and it's only the first 10 minutes of the webinar. So thank you very much for your time, Representative, and we'll see you again sometime soon. Thank you. Okay, let's keep going. What a great way to get our webinar started. So let's get into of the slides today. We're going to have, like I said, more special guests coming in. So the first thing I want to talk about is something that Representative Hollins just talked about, which is thinking through, why are you here? What are the issues that drive you? Why are you on this webinar? Why do you want to run? What are the issues that matter most? So put them in the chat, and I'm going to read some of them. I'm going to read some of them out as they come in. Climate change, great. Curious, also great. Healthcare, great. Educational equity, oh, they're all coming in fast. I'm going to skip some, I'm sorry. Democratic government reform, reproductive justice, criminal justice, great, great, great. I love them all. Amazing. So you all have a diversity of reasons why it is that you want to run. And each of those reasons is going to and should impact which seat you choose to run for. Another way of thinking about this is the power of your personal story. We have a whole training on telling your personal story, so I'm not going to get into the intricacies of it now, though we will put a link to where you can see all of the old recordings in the Q&A, so you guys can take a look. But the long and short is that the best way for you to communicate what office you want to run for and why is by this combination of elements of your story, I care about healthcare for these reasons, and your care of the community. I care about healthcare, and I see the way that the lack of healthcare access is impacting my community. And so because of that, I want to run for this office. The reason I like to start off with this in this training is because it's really important to get centered on that concept when you're determining what office to run for. People are going to ask you over and over again why you're running and why you're running for this seat. And this is a really good formula for thinking through how you answer that question. The other question, well, there's a lot of questions. The other thing you want to know are, what are your options? It's really easy to know that there are members of Congress that you can run for mayor or governor, but there's actually a ton of seats out there that are really interesting and can sometimes be really powerful. So Emily's List has this tool, which we will also put in the chat box, called Where Can I Run? And I'm going to show you an example of what it looks like in just a second. But essentially, the idea is that you put in your name and your address and what year you want to run, and you can see every option possible to you, not just options for seats that are open in the sense of there's no one running in them, but every single seat. And it's really cool and interesting because it'll teach you all the opportunities that are out there. So this was, I live in DC, and this is what happened when I looked up, just for example, what it would look like if I ran in the District of Columbia in 2022. DC is, of course, not a state, but it has a very extensive city government and lots of different positions that are out there. So I looked up what was available in 2022. They had everything from the council at large to the council chairman, to the attorney general, to these really local offices called advisory neighborhood commissions. I know that I am not an attorney, so I probably shouldn't run for attorney general. And I know that I'm really passionate about, actually, I am very passionate about this one crosswalk that really needs new stoplights at the end of my block. So it might be a good idea for me to run for something really hyper local, because I actually do care deeply about that crosswalk. Now, DC is small. It has only a limited number of positions that are even available. But in places like New York City or California, there are really interesting, incredibly powerful positions that I, before starting this job, had never heard of. For example, in California, there is a water board, water council. Those of you in California can provide me with the exact title. And that's a really powerful position in California. That helps deal with intricacies and politics and resources of water in California. And that's a really small board. So if you care a lot about climate change, that might be a really interesting place for you to get started. Similarly, in New York, my understanding is that the garbage disposal process and running for the seat that oversees that is incredibly powerful. It actually plays a really large role in city planning. So there are some roles that you may not have ever heard of before, but are actually deeply influential when it comes to getting things done where you are. So that's why this tool is really great, and also why knowing what you care about is so important, because it allows for you to get creative about how you want to run and where. So let's assume you've left this webinar, you've decided you want to run, you know some of the options you're interested in. What are you going to do? You're going to start with research. The first is finding the right race, which we've talked a little bit about already. What types of seats are available and when, which you can learn through the Run to Win tool. Where should I run tool? Apologies. Is the seat open? Will you be challenging someone who is on the other side of the aisle? Will you be challenging an incumbent on your side? Is it nonpartisan? Is there someone in that seat right now? Someone retiring? Let's find out. What is the history of the seat in the district? So does it typically vote Republican or Democrat? Does it flip between the two? What's the history of the seat? Have there been any important changes? Redistricting is coming up. We are going to have to see how that all turns out. And that is probably going to impact at least some races around the country. How are you a reflection of your district? So this is both in terms of your identity and your politics. Are you, if you are running a really progressive campaign in a really progressive district, that's great. If you are a white person running in a majority minority district, that's going to require some more work on your part to make sure that you are trusted by that community. And if you're a person of color running in a majority white district, again, you want to be talking to the community and talking about the ways in which your values are representative of the community at large. There's no correct answer here. There's no right or wrong. It is just a question of thinking about what's the kind of work that I need to do in order to be successful. And you also want to think about other elections that may impact yours. So for example, if you're running in a presidential year, you will have high turnout. If you are running in an off-year special election, then you're going to have to do a little bit more legwork to make sure people even know that there's an election in the first place. You also want to know facts about the race itself. So what are the applicable election laws? This is all very accessible information. It's a lot, but it's all very accessible online. How do you get on the ballot? Is there going to be a primary? We talked about if the seat was open or not. That can play a role in all of this. And how many people have voted in previous elections? How many votes do you need to win? The reason that that is important is because you need to have a really solid understanding of what it takes to win, both because you want to win and because you need to make sure that you are willing to put in the work to match what it is that you want. So for example, big component of running for office is raising the money that's necessary to win. Every race has a completely different set of costs. Running for the mayor of Los Angeles costs a whole lot more than running for the mayor of my small town where I grew up in New Jersey, Titusville, which I think my next door neighbor won. They are completely different races, and so you need to know the history of the race, the different costs associated with it, so that you can think about, how can I fundraise? Do I have the capacity and the drive to fundraise as much as necessary for this race? You also will want to know things about it, like what the margins have been. If it's traditionally held by a Republican, is your goal to simply narrow those margins and then run again? Maybe you'll win the second time. Are you trying to go all out the first time? Having a deep understanding of your state is really important for making sure that your race is a really important way of making sure that you set your goals from the beginning and follow through on them. There are a lot of places to learn all of these things, but particularly around fundraising and the different costs associated. You can go physically to your Department of Elections. Do that after you've been vaccinated, please. You can go to Ballotpedia, which is one of my favorite websites on the internet. You can learn everything you want to know about the history of a district, about the voting patterns, about who currently holds the seat. Ballotpedia is the website. You can also use Google, our good friends, and also most of the Department of Elections have campaign finance reports, which allow for you to learn more about the history of the cost of a seat online. They all have them, but most of them should be online. You can access this stuff at any time. You can use it to make your game plan and to decide what seat it is that you want to run for. Similarly, you want to start off strong with your fundraising. Though this training is ultimately about identifying where your values and skills match with a seat, we would be remiss if we didn't also talk about fundraising. Fundraising demonstrates your strengths and priorities, and it also reflects the narrative of your campaign. So being a strong fundraiser is a great way to demonstrate to others that you're a serious contender. And also it helps in your planning process to determine what seat you want to run for. So if you want to run, for example, for governor of a large state, that's going to require a lot more money. If you feel prepared to do that, then great, let's do it. And we're going to talk a little bit about how. But similarly, if you feel like, I don't have the capacity to fundraise the amount that is required for me to be competitive here, maybe you want to start on a lower race or a smaller race. That will help you develop your networks, help you build your base of people so you can continue to develop your political career. You want to think about how much money will you raise? Will you be able to get donors in your state? What's the average contribution that you're looking for? Lots of big questions. We just ran a training on fundraising fundamentals, which we will put in the chat, that can answer some more of these questions. But I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of how to get started in the planning process here. The main thing that I want you to think about is something that Emily's List calls the circles of benefit. Essentially, the idea, and this is spoken about at length in the fundraising training, is that you want to start off strong by fundraising as much as possible from within your personal circles. And then you are able to fundraise more and more and more over time. But you want to start off strong with that early money in your personal circles. So you want to have a really clear idea of who is actually in those circles, a process that we and every other fundraising guru will call Rolodexing. So you may recall the old school sort of flippy things where you had people's phone numbers and addresses and all of that, Rolodexing. That's the terminology that remains. So when you are thinking about running, before you announce, before you make a final decision as to where you want to run, you want to Rolodex. You want to focus on your personal circle. Who do you know that your opponent doesn't know? Who do you have access that no one else does? how is it that you can game out how much you'll be able to fundraise in your particular area based off of all of the Rolodexing that you've done. And you want to write it out, make a spreadsheet. There's a lot of resources that Emily's List has that I will mention later on that help you do this. You want to establish your plans, goals, and benchmarks. We talked about how many votes you need, how many signatures you need to get on the ballot, and prepare your pitch. Why are you the right candidate? Why are you the right candidate for this role right now? And that goes back to your story and your purpose. You also want to focus on understanding your community. So we talked a little bit about the sort of financial aspects of it. Another really important part of winning is getting those relationships in. I'm going to just say as a disclaimer that one of our special guests is going to be joining soon. So keep an eye out for me to call her in. So in order for you to build the relationships that you need to be successful, you want to start showing up. So you want to attend your county Democratic meetings as much as possible. You want to connect with your local elected Democratic officials. You want to seek out activists that care about the same things that you care about. So if you have said that you really care about reproductive justice, if you really care about climate change, you should get in with those folks who are organizing on the ground every day and find out how you can earn their support as early as possible. That's going to help establish you as a credible and credentialed person in the community. As you're having these conversations, you're going to be able to do something called power mapping. It's a little technical, I'll admit it, but I find it to be really helpful. And essentially a power map allows for you to determine what your community looks like, who has power, who supports you, who doesn't, that kind of thing. So for example, let's say you are good friends with the mayor of your town, who in this case, my made up scenario is Mayor Emily. And Mayor Emily supports you and has endorsed you. Great, she's your neighbor. That sounds wonderful. The head of the local union is even more powerful than Mayor Emily and is mostly on your side, but you still have to build that relationship. Other city councilors, this is assuming you're running for a city council race, other city councilors are kind of sitting it out. They're like, I don't want to deal with the politics of this. And of course, your opponent is opposed to you winning your race, but does have influence and power. But unfortunately, your parents probably don't. This is a made up scenario. For all I know, your moms are actually incredibly powerful people. But this helps me think through how it is that I want to figure out what my community looks like, what are the relationships that I have, what are the relationships I need to build, what are the gaps that exist. I find this helpful. There's lots of ways it doesn't have to be in this exact chart format, but I think it's helpful for thinking about your community and identifying how you want to continue your work. You also want to understand some of the politics. I love this GIF. I think it's completely appropriate. There are a lot of questions that you should have answered or at least start exploring as you begin your run for office. How are the state and local parties structured and who's in charge? Is there a mayor or a county chair that you need to start working with? Do you want to get into those relationships as early as possible? Are there any electeds that are appropriate for you to build relationships with? Maybe someone who's retiring, someone who used to hold your job, that kind of thing. Do you live in a state that has a strong labor presence? Do you need, if so, is labor really going to be the deciding factor in all of this? Hello, Secretary Bellows. I'll be right with you. What impact do other community leaders have or big level donors? What role do they play in understanding the politics of where you are? And what will be the politics of the seat? Are you going to be a challenger? Will there be a crowded primary? All sorts of really big questions that are really important to answer. So we're going to keep going on all of this, but I believe Secretary Bellows was great. Okay, we've been joined by our next special guest, which is Secretary Shenna Bellows. So I'm going to just read a quick bio for you, Secretary, and then I'll hand it over to you. Thank you so much for being here. Secretary of State Shenna Bellows is Maine's 50th Secretary of State, sworn into her first 2-year term on January 4th of this very year. She is Maine's first female Secretary of State. Secretary Bellows previously served 2 terms in the Maine Senate from 2016 to 2020, representing 11 towns in southern Kennebec County. In the Maine Senate, she served as Senate Chair of the Labor and Housing Committee and served on the Judiciary Committee. She's a 2020 presidential elector in the Electoral College. Secretary Bellows most recently led the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine as an executive director from 2018 to 2020. Previously, she owned Bellows and Company, a nonprofit consulting business where she worked with organizations such as the Sierra Club's Maine chapter, Consumers for Affordable Healthcare, and the Maine Women's Lobby. She also served as an interim director of LearningWorks. In 2014, Secretary Bellows was the Democratic nominee for US Senate in Maine. So Secretary Bellows, we are so excited to hear from you and looking forward to hearing about how you chose to run for the multitude of seats that you run for and what advice you have for folks on this call as they try and determine where they should run.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction.
Being here.
Yes, no, it's my pleasure. I really, I'm thrilled to be with Emily's List today. So I was asked to talk about how I chose to run my race. And first, let me just say, if you were thinking about running for elected office, you should. I have run for 3 different elected offices and won twice and lost once. And my decision-making process for each of those offices was slightly different. And I just thought I would share my personal story as appropriate. And then if there's time for questions, great. And if there's not, that's okay. So my first race was running for US Senate against Susan Collins. I was head of the ACLU of Maine at the time. I had never run for elected office. I had done training through the Yale Campaign School for Women, through Emily's List, and through Emerge Maine. So I'd had some really wonderful mentors and trainers, and I'd been thinking about it for some time. No one asked me to run. What happened was I found myself in coalition meetings on reproductive rights and justice, on marriage equality, and on privacy. And a number of times, comments were made in the room, someone should run against Susan Collins. And there would be some consensus, yes, and yet no one would sort of step forward. And so finally, at one point in time, I just came to the decision that in looking around, no one else was willing or interested in doing it. And so I talked to my husband, I talked to my family, and we agreed that I should move forward with doing that. And so I did. So that was my first race. I lost. I will say I had a fabulous female campaign manager and women in leadership in my fundraising team and my field team. And that was really powerful to have a women-led campaign and to be part of that. But I also like to say that I lost forward. So while I didn't win the US Senate race, because of the strength of our field game and our communications, our television advertising, our public messaging, it raised my profile in the state. I exited that race with very high name recognition and positive name recognition. So people didn't want to choose me over Susan Collins, but they thought that I seemed like a nice person who really had some good ideas. That came in handy in 2016 when my state Senate seat opened up. I hadn't contemplated running at the time. I was working full-time. I'd started my own business. I wasn't sure that I was ready for another campaign. Campaigns are exhausting. It's really challenging, especially in terms of time with your family. But leadership within the party came to me and they said, we've done polling and your name recognition is terrific. Your positive name recognition is terrific. We think you would be an excellent candidate in this seat, which had been previously held by a Republican. So I went for some long hikes and runs and really talked it through with my husband, talked through what it might look like to run. I did a doors plan. So in Maine, you win state Senate and state representative races by knocking on doors and talking to voters directly. So party leadership said, to win, you need to knock on 10,000 doors. And I was working full time. So I said, okay, how would I do 10,000 doors? And I figured it out and I decided that I was ready. And it was a wonderful decision. I am so glad I ran. I won in 2016 in a district that Trump also won in 2016. And I credit my door knocking campaign 100%. I won, that's a great question. How did having that ACLU leadership role impact my optics as a candidate? Was it helpful, harmful, or admired? I would say that it was helpful with some people in terms of the sort of libertarian constitutional stand up for the Bill of Rights and Constitution aspect of things. It was used as an attack by some of my opponents who said she's too liberal for this district, the ACLU being perceived as being very liberal. At the end of the day, I think that there were both pros and cons that didn't impact my overall candidacy. And what I would say to anyone thinking about running, your story is unique and special, and it makes you you. So don't run away from any part of your own personal narrative. Think through what are the strengths of your narrative? What do you want to amplify? Why do you want to move forward from that lived experience that you bring to the table that is uniquely yours? So I never tried to hide my ACLU background. I tried to celebrate the aspects of it that were particularly compelling to my district. And that was part of my story in getting elected. I ran for re-election in 2018. I won. It was a really tough race because I then had a voting record. I am very progressive, and my district was more conservative than I was. I ran for re-election in 2020 and won again. In 2020, I decided, so again, this is the decision-making process. And my other piece of advice is talk to your friends, but talk to more than one. So a year ago, it was February of 2020, I thought about the fact that the current Secretary of State at that time was going to be term limited out. I was very interested in the role, especially as Chief Elections Officer, given my voting rights work at the ACLU. I'd also done a lot of work on license and identity. And the Secretary of State in Maine oversees the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. So I talked to a couple of friends and they said, you're never going to win. So-and-so has that locked up, right? A really likable, wonderful man. He's got that race in the bag. There's no way you're going to win. Why would you give up a Senate seat to run for this? And so I was dissuaded by the practical arguments of you can't win. And so I tucked that dream or idea away. I took it back out in the summer. And I talked to a couple of other folks and I was like, I really want to do this, but so-and-so and so-and-so said you can't win. And these dear people said, you know what, you can't. Don't do it. And so I put it back in the closet and was like, okay, I'm not going to run for Secretary of State. I wouldn't want to endanger my Senate seat in doing so. And then about a week before the general election, the timing is a little bit blurry, a friend called me in frustration about the fact that only men were running for Secretary of State in Maine, and that in our 200-year history, only men had ever served as Secretary of State. She was just venting. And I said, funny story. I thought about running, but I talked to some people and they didn't think it was a viable race for me. And I decided not to. And she said, what? She said, your resume is perfect for this. She said, your work on voting rights, your work on licenses, you would be a fabulous Secretary of State. Why is the fear of losing holding you back? And so I said, let me think about it. And I took a week and I thought about it. I talked to some family. I talked to some really close friends. I talked through that fear of losing, which was very real for me. And I decided to go for it. So I ran a 3-week campaign for Secretary of State. In Maine, the legislature elects the Secretary of State. It was very much like door knocking. So what's the best time of day for door knocking? Right after work when people are home, and on the weekends when people are home. That's what I did when I was door knocking while working full time. What's the best time to reach legislators? anytime. I called through the entire legislature. I talked to everybody at least once. I sent follow-up handwritten cards. I called through people again. I reached out to influencers and had people call on my behalf. And that's how I became Maine's first female Secretary of State, Maine's 50th Secretary of State. I was sworn in on January 4th. And this is a dream job. It has given me voice. I am testifying in support of HR 1, the elections reform package, before Congress on Thursday. I am able in Maine as the Chief Elections Officer to be moving forward with the legislature some really important reforms. I'm getting to advance equity and inclusion across my agency and getting to think about some of the reforms in our Bureau of Motor Vehicles to make sure that we're not punishing people for being poor through our driver license laws and suspension laws. So that's my story about my path. Let's look at the great questions in the chat. So how does one find a campaign manager and team? That's a specific set of skills. So I recruited folks from people I met through the trainings I did through Emily's List, the Campaign School for Women, and Emerge. So my campaign manager was from Emerge. My finance, she started out as my assistant and became head of my call time and is now working in fundraising nationally. I met her at the Yale Campaign School for Women. I met my team through a lot of the training that I was doing, and some of them I met through other political campaigns, which is a question here, advice for those getting started that only have private sector experience and street cred. How do we make that jump to networking to meet influential people in politics? So I came from the nonprofit sector. I came from the ACLU. I did meet quite a few people through issue advocacy campaigns. So perhaps finding an issue that you're passionate about and finding an opportunity to get involved, to bring your private sector skills or volunteerism to that issue might be a good way to network. I also just started showing up at Democratic Party fundraisers and events and I always set a goal. I would say, okay, I'm going to go to this event and I want to meet these 3 people. So I'd have in mind 3 people that I wanted to meet at that event. Or maybe it wouldn't be quite so clear about who was going to be there, but I would force myself. I'm actually an introvert, to go and give my business card to 3 new people to engage in meaningful conversations with them. That's the practice I continue. Well, it's the pandemic, so not so much today, but it was a way that I got involved and started to get networked. Can I find out whether the seat I'm going to run for has an incumbent by going to fec.gov? I'm going to kick this one over to Emily's List, but I would say that usually Googling will help you figure out whether there's an incumbent in the seat, and then Googling the re-election of that person, because generally there is an incumbent. Your open seats happen and they're great. But if you Google their re-election, you'll find out, or Google that person's name plus retirement, you'll get some sort of sense. But maybe Emily's List has some better advice when it comes to that.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, we'll save it for the Q&A section that we've got coming.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And what if you have no experience? How hard is it to run? I think it's really important. One of the things that I did in each of my races was sit down and build a projected calendar and schedule, because it is hard when you're running for a federal office. You have almost no time. Call time and fundraising becomes really important. I tried to do 8 hours of call time a day when I was running for federal office. When I ran for state senate, it wasn't call time, it was knocking on doors. And again, my goal was 10,000 doors in a cycle. I could do about 50 doors in an hour, which, is that right? No, I couldn't. I could do 20 doors.
That's very fast walking.
Sometimes I could only do 10 doors in an hour. So I could do like 75 doors on a Saturday, and I'm slow. So I had to chart that out. If I can only do, 30 doors in an evening or 75 doors on a Saturday, how many Saturdays and how many evenings did I need to get to that 10,000? So I think scheduling is really, really important. And then sitting down with your family and saying, okay, I'm not going to be available for this family reunion or these soccer games or these things, but I am always going to make, for my husband and I, it was every Friday night and Sunday morning, regardless, like we knew that that was time that we had together. And if for any reason anything encroached on that, then there was a tree, right? So if Friday night got interrupted somehow, and it almost never did, then Saturday night was going to be his.
Secretary Bellows, I think unfortunately that's all the time we have for questions right now, but I'm so grateful for your time and your examples and stories and your championing of women getting things done. So I just really want to thank you again. And we're also appreciative of your ability to answer some questions and stick around.
Thank you so much to all those women in this training. You should absolutely run. You bring something unique and special to this. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Thank you.
Right, Secretary. What an amazing group we get to have today. I love them. Okay, let's keep going, and we're going to get to the
as quickly as possible. So a lot of this was just reflected in what Secretary Bellows just said, but before you run, you want to make sure that key political players know that you're running. You don't want major donors to find out about your announcement through Twitter or through the newspaper. You want them to know it's happening and that they can jump in on day one and support you. And you also want to make sure that that goes for key supporters writ large. So Secretary Bellows talked about getting involved and engaged in local democratic institutions and issue-based organizations that you care about. You really want to make sure that those folks know before you announce that it's happening. All of it is to say that there are a few questions that only you can answer that I think this sort of summarizes our work here today. And then we're going to get to those questions. Why do you want to run? So what is your story? What is the purpose that you have that you bring to this work? What do you offer to voters? What makes you unique? What makes you able to give them something particular in order to advance their community? Do you have the discipline and the drive to win? That comes down to money that you need to raise. That comes down to, as Secretary Bellows said, how many doors you want to knock or need to knock, as the case may be. And are you able to really make that plan from the get-go? Are you willing to raise the money that is necessary to win? So that doesn't mean that you're a great fundraiser right now. It doesn't mean that you are a wealthy person. It means that you are willing to put in the work. That is a very different thing. And fundraising is a skill that we can and will and do teach. And of course, all of this should lead you to what seat do you want to run for and why? How are you going to answer that question? So I hope you all have learned some great examples of how people have made the decision to run for the offices they chose, and that they have impacted your thinking on what office you might want to run for. And I wanted to bring in some real campaign experts for this last part, our Q&A, to make sure that you all had the best of what Emily's List has to offer in terms of their Q&A. So I wanted to introduce two members of our campaign team. First is Molly Cowan. Molly is the Northeast Regional Director and for state and local campaigns, and Suyen Wei, who is the Pacific Northwest and California Director, also for state and local campaigns. Hello, party people.
Hey.
Hello.
Thanks, Vicky.
Questions in advance of this webinar via text, and also we've got some that came in today, so I'm just going to start from the top and go on down. What are the first steps that you suggest when deciding to run for office?
I think you guys, touched on some of that in the webinar itself. And feel free to jump in here, Molly. But it really does depend on the issues that you care about. Having been a campaign manager, I get calls. We would get calls in the campaign being like, I really think that you guys should. And being a congressional campaign, it was what we would get calls from people saying, well, what's your position on our, trash pickup? And it's like, well, a member of Congress doesn't do that. So if, someone is really passionate about that, that is something that is hyper local. So, being, what are you doing about like the school's policy on that? Well, you know, that might be something that's more on the school board level. So figuring out what issues you care about and, you know, how you want things to change and then seeing what office openings are, that's a way to, you know, start thinking about and doing the soul searching on what office you should run for.
Molly, anything you want to add?
I think that Sue is right. I think you need to decide what issues you want to advocate for, and then decide and figure out where you can be most impactful. The other thing to think about is, you know, realistically, do you want to raise $1 million? Do you want to raise $100,000? Like, you can build out what you want to run for based on your capacity. You also have to think about geography. If you want to run for the state assembly, but you live, you know, way far away from the Capitol, how are you going to do that? So these are all, you know, really, these are all things to think about. Then there's the other components of like, is there somebody great who's already serving in that seat? Is your goal to be, you know, governor of your state in 10 years and 3 consecutive losses and a hard state legislative race is not going to set you up for success? So there's a lot of different things to think about. You have to think about what's important to you.
Great points. And off of that, Molly, and then Sue, another question that we got was exactly on what you just said, Molly. If the seat is held by a popular incumbent, how would you recommend people consider challenging or not challenging, or just thinking through if the seat is held by a popular incumbent on either side of the aisle?
So I think we can look at Shenna Bellows as a really good example of, you know, taking the bull by the horns, running against Susan Collins, who was not, I mean, she won very easily this time. And she was, you know, there was real understanding that she was not who we all thought she was. But it set Shenna up to be the first person that the state legislature called when there was an opening. And it made her, you know, it raised her profile in a way that did her no disservice. There's also, you know, there's cases like AOC, Ayanna Pressley, in these other districts in safe Democratic seats who were sick of waiting for the old white dude to move on and decided to primary them anyway. So there's a whole host of things that you need to think about. And then there's Joe Kennedy, who just primaried Markey in Massachusetts, and he lost. So, you know, all of these things are sort of a gamble, and it's something that you really need to think about.
Yeah, and also to add to that, I think Molly kind of touched on this point where I think people who want to run for office are really smart people. They do their research, and you think that it seems like there's this like linear path, like, okay, maybe you run for city council, and then that, you know, then there's a congressional seat opening, and then like you go on to maybe statewide office. Like, that's not the case. You know, you can have a platform and an impact in whatever office you run for. You know, with AOC, like, she was, you know, a bartender who wanted to see some change in her community, even though, you know, the person that she had primaried was there forever. You know, same with Ayanna Pressley. Like, you know, she was a city councilor, and there was, you know, a popular incumbent there. And then you hear about kind of the people who were being looked at for the presidential race in LA. It was Eric Garcetti. There was presidential buzz on him, even though he had never held something of, you know, a large. He had never been representative of, like, in the federal sense. So you can have an impact wherever you go, and it depends on how you build out from there. There's no linear path. So yeah, like, if that is helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I think we definitely, the case studies of Ayanna Pressley and AOC are extremely interesting. We don't have the time to get into them today, but I do think that looking at, you know, Congressman Capilano, who Ayanna Pressley defeated in the primary, was a very popular progressive guy, but she was younger, more dynamic, more progressive. And so those are some really interesting things that she was able to highlight, and perhaps point to some things that are interesting for folks to take a look at when it comes to challengers, how it is that you can draw a contrast between who it is that you are running against. Does that sound accurate?
Yeah.
I think perhaps we only have time for one more question, but this question I thought was really interesting. Someone said, I absolutely hate fundraising. Is this an identifier that I am not qualified to run for any office?
So I would say that you have to be realistic about what you need in order to win a race. Now, oftentimes we think that you need money to win a race, which is almost universally true. However, there are, the Maine state legislature, for example, there are clean elections up there. So they collect seed money and then they get matching funds. And that's how most of the candidates up in Maine run races. So while it requires fundraising, it doesn't require the kind of fundraising that we think about that goes into traditional races. Same with the New York City Council, for example. But I also think we have to be realistic about the role that money in politics plays. And you cannot get your message across to the amount of voters that you need to reach without funds. I serve in office myself, and I happen to love fundraising. I am probably the only person who I know who loves fundraising. And there are very few candidates who would raise their hand and say, yes, call time is my favorite thing. I look forward to it every day, and you can't stop me from calling people and asking for money. However, when you see success and you see how much, we have one in the chat, she loves fundraising. So there's another one, there's two on here. And so when you see it being successful, you will like it more. And so I don't think that it is a disqualifier. I think that we have to be very realistic about what it costs and takes to win a race and raise that amount of money. So whether you like it or not, doesn't matter.
And also, I think that we hear the debate, especially the national debate of like, oh, money in politics, but depending on the level of race, like you might have to raise way less money than you think. So for example, one of my states that I advise candidates in is Washington State. And the Seattle council races are up this cycle. They have something called democracy vouchers, where, every voter in Seattle gets 4 of them, and they're worth $25 each. So a huge part of your fundraising plan is outreaching to your supporters to get more people to give you their democracy vouchers. Like that's a huge part of it. So it might not be as much of a lift as you think. And I think thinking of fundraising, it's think of it as you want someone to have faith in your candidacy, and it's a small sort of investment. I think because of the campaign contribution limits in different places, you are meeting and talking to investors. It just stinks that like in Silicon Valley, someone can give you just like millions of dollars for your startup, but because of the campaign finance limits or whatever restrictions there are, you just have to meet with more investors. So yeah, and I think part of it is kind of thinking through in past elections, what are the funds that you need? Because it might not be as heavy or daunting as a lift once you start breaking it down into steps.
Absolutely. And I would be remiss as training director that fundraising is a skill that you can learn. You can hate it, but if you get more practice in it, as Molly said, the more successful that you become in it, the more comfortable you understand that you are with the mechanics of it, the less that you will hate it, honestly. And we have a lot of resources at Emily's List to help you overcome that particular hatred. It is a very, very, very common one. And that's why it's a skill that you can learn in the same way that you learned to ride a bike or anything else you learned in your life. With all of that said, that is actually all the time we have for today. I know we have a lot of questions that we couldn't get to, and I'm so excited that you sent them in and so sorry that we couldn't get to them. I wanted to thank our partners that have helped make these trainings possible, and also point you to other resources that you can learn from at Emily's List. First is the Training Center that has a lot of resources on fundraising, on messaging, on telling your story, everything under the sun is on the training center. It is free. Please take advantage of it. Hopefully there are some answers to your questions there. And additionally, we will send out a link to join our Run to Win Facebook group, which is the Facebook group where folks like you can ask questions of a large community of women who are running for office right now. So if you have a question that isn't answered in the training center, or if you just want something additional, please join the Facebook group and ask your question there. We will get to it. With all of that said, thank you all very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And we will see you all next time. Thank you.